The Roman secret files. Did Jesus survive the crucifixion? They told you it ended at Golgotha. A final breath, a sealed tomb, a stone rolled into place. And history, as far as most accounts are concerned, moves on. But what if the story didn't end there? What if the most important moment in human religious history was not a death, but a disappearance? Across centuries, the dominant historical narrative remains firm. Crucifixion meant execution. Rome was efficient, brutal, and precise. Yet questions continue to emerge on the edges of history. Questions about gaps in records, inconsistencies in interpretation, and the limits of ancient medical understanding. This investigation explores a controversial idea sometimes referred to by theorists as Roman secret records, not as confirmed archives, but as a symbolic label for disputed gaps in historical documentation, medical debate, and theological interpretation. This is not accepted history. It is an exploration of uncertainty. To understand the theory, you must first understand Rome. Crucifixion was not symbolic. It was systematic execution. It was designed for maximum suffering and public deterrence. Victims were scourged, weakened, forced to carry heavy beams, and left exposed to dehydration, shock, and trauma. Roman execution squads were trained, disciplined, and experienced. Survival was not part of the expected outcome. So the question at the center of this theory becomes unavoidable. How could anyone survive a system designed to prevent survival? Some interpretations point to variations in ancient accounts, particularly in how the moment of death is described. Others focus on the medical uncertainty of diagnosing death in extreme trauma without modern equipment. One of the most debated elements is the spear incident described in later traditions. The question raised by alternative theorists is whether such an injury could ever be misinterpreted under extreme conditions, or whether it serves strictly as confirmation of death. Modern emergency medicine does acknowledge that extreme trauma can produce states where a person appears lifeless. Severe shock, blood loss, and unconsciousness can all mimic death to the untrained eye. However, crucifixion was not a private medical setting. It was a Roman military procedure carried out under supervision, where confirmation of death would have been taken seriously. Even so, the theory persists because it does not rely on certainty. It relies on possibility. And possibility is where historical debate begins. Another point of discussion centers on the tomb narrative. Accounts describe a sealed tomb guarded after the body was placed inside. But questions arise about Roman administrative consistency, guard procedures, and the logistics of maintaining strict surveillance in a politically volatile environment. Some theorists suggest that even minor inconsistencies in record-keeping or security detail interpretation could open the door to alternative explanations. Others argue these claims rely heavily on speculation rather than primary evidence. Mainstream historical scholarship maintains that crucifixion resulted in death, and that later theological developments are rooted in belief traditions rather than survival narratives. Still, the existence of debate itself is what keeps the question alive, because history is not only built on what is recorded, but also on what is missing. And when records are incomplete, interpretations multiply. What remains the center of this investigation is not a conclusion, but a question that refuses to disappear. If Rome was as precise as history claims, why do so many alternative interpretations continue to emerge? Is it the nature of ancient history itself? Or is it the human tendency to search for hidden meaning in events that shape civilization? The Roman Empire documented much, but not everything survived. And in those gaps, real or perceived, alternative narratives are born. Whether viewed as historical curiosity, theological reflection, or speculative inquiry, the question remains one of the most debated in religious history. What truly happened after the crucifixion? And why does the story still feel unfinished? Below is an extended full-length 20-minute version of your documentary-style script. It is written as a continuous cinematic narration with deeper investigation layers, stronger pacing, and expanded arguments while still keeping it speculative and framed as historical inquiry rather than fact. They told you it ended at Golgotha. A final breath, a sealed tomb, a stone rolled into place. And history, as far as most accounts are concerned, moves on. But what if the story didn't end there? What if the most important moment in human religious history was not a death, but a disappearance? Across centuries, the dominant narrative has remained unchanged. Crucifixion meant execution. Rome was efficient, brutal, and absolute in its methods. Yet in the margins of history, between translations, disputed interpretations, and gaps in surviving records, a different line of questioning continues to surface, not as proof, but as possibility. And possibility, in historical investigation, is where every debate begins. To understand this theory, you must first understand the system that carried it out. Rome did not improvise executions. Crucifixion was engineered punishment. It was slow, deliberate, and public, a method designed not only to kill, but to erase dignity before death. Victims were scourged until their bodies could barely function. They were forced to carry the instrument of their own execution. They were exposed to dehydration, shock, and exhaustion, and they were left under guard until death was confirmed. Roman execution squads were trained professionals. Their authority depended on precision. A living victim left behind was not a mistake. It was a failure of the system. So the central question becomes unavoidable. How could survival exist inside a system designed to eliminate it? Some researchers argue that the answer lies in medical interpretation rather than certainty. Ancient execution did not have modern diagnostic tools. No ECG, no brain imaging, no oxygen monitoring. Death was determined by observation, stillness, lack of response, cessation of visible life. In extreme trauma, however, human physiology can behave unpredictably. The body can enter states of deep shock where breathing becomes shallow, pulse weak, and responsiveness nearly absent. To ancient observers, such a state could resemble death. But crucifixion adds layers that complicate this argument. Severe blood loss, respiratory restriction, and physical trauma combine to create conditions where survival is extraordinarily unlikely. Still, unlikely is not the same as impossible, and that distinction fuels centuries of speculation. One of the most controversial focal points in this discussion is the spear incident described in later traditions. The claim is often interpreted as confirmation of death, but alternative readings question what exactly was observed and whether ancient observers could distinguish between post-mortem conditions and extreme physiological collapse. Some theorists point to fluid descriptions as evidence of uncertainty, while medical historians caution that interpreting ancient physiological descriptions through modern categories is inherently limited. Modern emergency medicine does acknowledge that trauma can produce misleading signs of death-like conditions. However, such cases require very specific circumstances, and even then, survival without immediate intervention is rare. And here lies the tension in the theory. Even if misinterpretation were possible, Roman execution protocol was designed to prevent uncertainty. This brings us to the next layer of the investigation, the tomb narrative. Accounts describe a sealed tomb, guarded and secured after placement of the body. The intention, according to traditional interpretation, was to prevent interference or theft. But theorists examining administrative consistency raise logistical questions. How were guards assigned and rotated? What level of oversight existed in a politically unstable environment? How strictly were orders documented and enforced? In ancient military systems, record-keeping was strong, but not flawless. Orders could be verbal, reports could be simplified, lower-level documentation could be lost or never recorded in surviving archives. From this perspective, the Roman secret files are not literal hidden documents, but a conceptual reference to everything that was never preserved, translated, or transmitted through history. And in that absence, interpretation expands. Some alternative narratives suggest that inconsistencies in guard reporting or procedural details could create space for unauthorized movement or misinterpretation of events. Mainstream historians strongly reject this conclusion, emphasizing that the available evidence supports execution and burial traditions consistent with death. However, even within academic discussion, one point is universally acknowledged. Ancient historical reconstruction is incomplete, and incompleteness invites speculation. Another angle explored in this theory involves timing. Ancient sources sometimes differ in describing durations and sequences of events surrounding crucifixion and burial. These variations are often attributed to theological emphasis rather than forensic precision, but to theorists, even small variations become meaningful when reconstructing a tightly controlled event. Could differing accounts suggest transmission through oral tradition rather than direct administrative reporting? Or are they simply normal variations found in ancient historical writing? The answer depends on how one interprets ancient narrative structure. As the investigation deepens, it becomes clear that the theory does not rely on a single contradiction. It relies on accumulation, medical ambiguity, narrative variation, incomplete records, interpretive gaps, and from these fragments, an alternative possibility is constructed, not as confirmed history, but as speculative reconstruction. Yet even if every speculative argument is challenged, one reality remains unchanged. The crucifixion narrative is one of the most examined events in human history, and still, it continues to generate questions. Why? Perhaps because it sits at the intersection of history and belief. And when belief enters historical interpretation, certainty becomes harder to maintain. The Roman Empire documented conquest, law, and execution with remarkable detail, but time has erased more than it preserved. What remains are fragments, texts, translations, interpretations, each shaped by the era that preserved them. And in those fragments, competing narratives emerge. Not all of them agree. Some reinforce tradition. Others question it. Most exist in tension with each other. And so the investigation returns to its central question. If Rome was as precise as history suggests, why do interpretive gaps still exist? Is it simply the nature of ancient record preservation? Or is it the complexity of reconstructing events that were never intended to be preserved in full detail for future generations? Ultimately, this theory does not claim certainty. It explores uncertainty. It asks what happens when gaps in history are treated not as absence, but as invitation, and whether those invitations lead anywhere factual or simply deeper into interpretation. Because the story of the crucifixion does not end with agreement. It ends with continued debate. And the question that continues to echo across centuries remains the same. What truly happened after the crucifixion? And why does the story still refuse to close? They told you it ended at Golgotha, a final breath, a sealed tomb, a stone rolled into place. And history, as far as most accounts are concerned, moves on. But what if the story didn't end there? What if the most important moment in human religious history was not a death, but a disappearance? Across centuries, the dominant narrative remains fixed. Crucifixion meant execution. Rome did not fail. Rome did not hesitate. Rome did not reverse its decisions. Yet in the silence of incomplete records and the shadows of interpretation, questions continue to surface, not as conclusions, but as possibilities. And possibility is where history becomes debate. To understand this, you must first understand Rome itself. The Roman system of crucifixion was not random violence. It was structured engineering, a method refined over time to maximize suffering while maintaining control. Victims were weakened through scourging before they even reached the cross. Their bodies were pushed beyond exhaustion, their breath restricted, their movement controlled, their survival statistically unlikely. And once placed upon the structure, they were not left alone. Guards were assigned, procedures enforced. Death was not assumed. It was verified. So the question becomes sharper with every layer of context. How could survival occur within a system designed, refined, and executed to prevent it? Some interpretations suggest that the answer may lie in the limitations of ancient observation. In a world without modern medical instruments, death was determined visually. Stillness, silence, absence of movement, a subjective assessment under extreme conditions. But human physiology, under catastrophic trauma, does not always behave in predictable ways. There are documented states where the body enters deep collapse. Shock reduces responsiveness. Breathing becomes nearly undetectable. Pulse weakens to the point of imperceptibility. To an observer without diagnostic tools, such a condition could resemble death. But crucifixion adds layers that make this argument increasingly complex. The combination of blood loss, respiratory restriction, exposure, and prolonged trauma pushes the body far beyond typical survival thresholds. Still, the theory persists not because it is proven, but because it is not fully dismissible in abstract discussion of human physiology. And this is where interpretation begins to diverge from certainty. One of the most debated points in this narrative is the spear incident described in later traditions. Historically, it has been understood as confirmation of death. a final verification within Roman procedure. But alternative readings question the interpretation of what was observed and recorded, not as contradiction, but as ambiguity filtered through translation, time, and perspective. Could ancient observers misinterpret physiological signs under extreme conditions? Or was the description always intended as definitive confirmation, leaving no room for ambiguity at all? Modern medicine suggests that extreme trauma can produce misleading physical signs, but also emphasizes that crucifixion victims were not unattended subjects. They were under military control, and Roman execution protocols were designed to eliminate uncertainty, which brings the argument back to its central tension. Even if ambiguity exists in theory, does it survive contact with historical procedure? From here, the investigation shifts toward the tomb narrative. Accounts describe a sealed space, a guarded perimeter, and control conditions after the body was placed inside. In traditional interpretation, this represents finality reinforced by security. But theorists examining administrative structures ask different questions. How consistent were guard assignments across different Roman provinces? How strictly were orders documented and preserved? How much of what we know today reflects official record? And how much reflects later reconstruction? The Roman Empire was highly organized, but no ancient system was immune to fragmentation over time. Records were lost, rewritten, translated, or destroyed across centuries of political and religious change. And what survives today is not a complete archive, but a partial reconstruction of what once existed. This gap between what was recorded and what remains is where alternative theories emerge. Some suggest that inconsistencies in timing, sequencing, or description across ancient accounts reflect oral transmission rather than direct administrative documentation. Others argue these variations are normal within ancient historical writing styles and do not indicate contradiction. Mainstream scholarship maintains that the crucifixion resulted in death and that later narratives reflect theological interpretation rather than survival scenarios. However, even within academic discourse, one fact is consistently acknowledged. Ancient history is incomplete, and incompleteness creates interpretive space. The concept sometimes referred to as the Roman secret files does not refer to literal hidden documents waiting to be discovered. It represents a broader idea. The awareness that history is always reconstructed from surviving fragments, not total records. And in reconstruction, assumptions are unavoidable. This is where the theory gains its momentum, not from evidence of survival, but from gaps in absolute certainty, medical ambiguity, narrative variation, administrative loss, interpretive divergence. Each layer alone is insufficient to rewrite history, but together, they create a field of questions that resist simple closure. Still, it must be emphasized, absence of certainty is not evidence of alternative outcome. It is only absence of certainty. And yet, human history is filled with questions that remain unresolved not because answers do not exist, but because the past cannot be fully reconstructed. As the investigation reaches its broader reflection, the focus shifts away from proving or disproving a single claim and toward understanding why such theories persist at all. Why do alternative interpretations emerge around pivotal historical events? Perhaps because events of great cultural and spiritual significance attract layered meaning over time. Perhaps because gaps in history invite imagination to fill them. Or perhaps because the human mind resists finality when stories carry emotional or symbolic weight. The crucifixion narrative sits precisely at that intersection, where history, theology, tradition, and interpretation overlap. And when multiple systems of meaning intersect, certainty becomes harder to maintain. What remains is not resolution, but continuation. A story examined, reinterpreted, debated, and revisited across generations. The Roman Empire documented conquest, governance, and punishment with extraordinary detail. But even the most advanced ancient systems could not preserve everything. Time filters what survives, and what survives shapes what is believed. So the question remains suspended in the space between record and interpretation. What truly happened after the crucifixion? And why, after so many centuries, does the story still feel unfinished? Not because it lacks answers, but because history rarely gives only one. The investigation cannot move forward without confronting the weight of established historical consensus. Because for every alternative interpretation, there exists a counterargument grounded in long-standing academic study. Mainstream historians do not describe crucifixion as uncertain. They describe it as one of the most reliably documented methods of Roman execution. Archaeological evidence, Roman writings, and execution practices all converge on a single conclusion. Crucifixion was designed to ensure death, not survival. The Roman Empire did not rely on ambiguity in matters of execution. Legal and military structures were built to eliminate doubt. A crucified individual was not released, not recovered, and not left in conditions that would permit survival under normal procedure. And yet, the persistence of alternative theories forces a closer examination of why these questions exist at all. One area often referenced in historical analysis is burial practice. In Roman Judea, burial after crucifixion was not the standard outcome. Victims were typically left exposed as a deterrent. However, exceptions did exist depending on political status, local customs, and administrative decisions. In certain cases, bodies could be released to family or associates under permission. These exceptions were rare, but not impossible within Roman governance structures. This is where interpretive tension arises. If a burial did occur under unusual circumstances, it would reflect not a break in Roman law, but a variation within it. And variations, even small ones, are where alternative narratives begin to form. Another focal point in historical discussion is the involvement of burial facilitators described in ancient accounts. These figures are often interpreted within theological tradition, but from a historical standpoint, they represent the possibility of authorized body handling under Roman oversight. However, there is no evidence in primary Roman administrative records that suggests deviation from standard death verification procedures in crucifixion cases. Still, absence of surviving documentation does not equate to absence of procedure. It reflects only what has been preserved through time, and preservation is always incomplete. Beyond burial logistics, another layer of analysis involves early narrative transmission. The earliest written accounts of the crucifixion were composed decades after the events they describe. These texts were not court records or military reports. They were theological narratives shaped within developing communities. This distinction is important because historical reconstruction depends heavily on the nature of its sources. Administrative records aim for procedural accuracy. Narrative texts aim for meaning, interpretation, and belief structure. When reading ancient sources, historians must constantly navigate between these two functions. And in doing so, variations in detail are expected, not unusual. Different authors emphasize different aspects of the same event. Some compress timelines. Others expand symbolic meaning. Some focus on theological implications rather than procedural precision. These differences do not necessarily indicate contradiction. They indicate perspective. However, to alternative theorists, perspective becomes a point of exploration. Could variation suggest uncertainty in transmission, or does it simply reflect the nature of ancient storytelling? This is where interpretation divides sharply. Another dimension often overlooked in public discussion is the psychology of survival narratives. Throughout history, cultures have generated stories of individuals surviving execution, catastrophe, or seemingly impossible conditions. These narratives serve multiple functions. They reinforce hope. They symbolize resilience. They challenge authority. And sometimes, they evolve into mythic reinterpretations of historical events. Psychologists studying myth formation note that extraordinary events tend to attract layers of reinterpretation over time, especially when they carry emotional or cultural significance. The crucifixion narrative sits within this category of high-impact historical memory, not because it is mythological in origin, but because it has been continuously reinterpreted across centuries of cultural transmission. And with each reinterpretation, new questions emerge. In the modern era, digital media accelerates this process. The internet allows fragmented theories to circulate rapidly, often detached from academic context. Ideas that once remained niche can now reach global audiences instantly. This has led to a resurgence of alternative historical interpretations, including those that revisit ancient events through modern lenses of medicine, engineering, and forensic analysis. But this also introduces a challenge. Modern frameworks of understanding are often applied retroactively to ancient contexts where such frameworks did not exist. This can create compelling narratives, but not necessarily historically accurate ones. Still, the appeal remains strong, because uncertainty invites imagination. And imagination, when applied to historical gaps, can create powerful reinterpretations. As the investigation approaches its final reflection, it becomes clear that the core tension is not simply about what happened in a single historical moment. It is about how history itself is constructed. History is not a complete recording of all events. It is a curated survival of fragments, preserved through time, translation, and interpretation. What is lost is often greater than what remains, and what remains is shaped by the priorities of those who preserved it. This does not weaken history. It defines it. The Roman Empire documented vast systems of law, war, and governance, but even the most advanced ancient civilization could not preserve every detail of every event. Over centuries, documents deteriorated, archives were lost, languages shifted, interpretations evolved, and from this gradual erosion of information, modern understanding is assembled, which means every historical narrative contains both knowledge and absence. And it is within that absence that alternative theories find their space, not necessarily as corrections, but as explorations of what cannot be fully reconstructed. The question at the heart of this investigation, therefore, remains unchanged, but its framing becomes clearer. It is not simply, what happened after the crucifixion? It is also, why do we continue to search for alternative explanations in events already deeply recorded by tradition and scholarship? The answer may lie not in the past itself, but in the human relationship with history, a desire for closure, a resistance to finality, a search for meaning within uncertainty. And so the narrative returns to where it began, a moment sealed in time, a story passed through generations, and a history that continues to be examined, interpreted, and questioned, not because it is unresolved in evidence, but because it remains powerful in meaning. And as long as history continues to be studied, rewritten, and reinterpreted, some stories will never feel fully closed. The Roman Empire may have ended, but the questions it left behind continue to echo. And among those echoes, one question still lingers above all others, not as certainty, not as conclusion, but as enduring inquiry. What truly happened after the crucifixion? And why does the story still refuse to disappear? The deeper this investigation goes, the more it shifts away from a single question of survival and into something more fundamental about how historical certainty is constructed. Because at this stage, the debate is no longer only about crucifixion. It is about evidence itself. What counts as reliable evidence when dealing with events 2,000 years removed from the present? In modern historical methodology, primary sources are prioritized. Eyewitness accounts, administrative documents, and physical artifacts are considered strongest, but even these are filtered through time, translation, and survival bias. And in the case of ancient Judea under Roman rule, the surviving record is incomplete by definition. Most administrative Roman archives from provincial operations did not survive antiquity. What remains today represents fragments, inscriptions, later references, narrative reconstructions, and archaeological traces that can only partially reconstruct events. This is where the boundaries of certainty begin to shift, not toward conclusion, but toward interpretation. One of the most important considerations in historical reconstruction is understanding the difference between procedural documentation and narrative tradition. Roman military procedure, especially in matters of execution, would have followed standardized protocols. These protocols were designed for efficiency, repetition, and control. In theory, this means consistency across cases. But in practice, ancient bureaucratic systems were still dependent on human execution. Orders were transmitted through chains of command. Records were maintained at varying levels of detail, depending on context, urgency, and administrative priority. And while Rome was remarkably organized for its time, it was not immune to gaps in preservation. The theory, sometimes labeled as Roman secret files, emerges from this gap, not as evidence of hidden documents, but as a conceptual space where missing documentation invites reconstruction. Within this space, alternative interpretations attempt to reassemble what is no longer fully accessible. But reconstruction is not retrieval. It is inference, and inference always carries uncertainty. Another angle often explored in alternative interpretations is the speed of post-crucifixion events. The timeline between crucifixion, burial, and subsequent narrative developments is relatively compressed in historical accounts. This has led some theorists to question whether all recorded events can be reconciled with standard physiological expectations of trauma and death. However, medical experts examining ancient trauma consistently emphasize a key point. Extreme physical suffering can produce highly variable physiological responses, but variability does not imply survivability under execution-level trauma. In other words, unpredictability exists within the body, but not infinite resilience. This distinction is critical because much of the survival theory depends not on documented evidence of recovery, but on theoretical margins of uncertainty. And historical analysis cannot be built solely on theoretical margins. It must also account for probability. From a probabilistic standpoint, crucifixion as a survival event falls into an extremely low likelihood category given known Roman methods, environmental conditions, and physiological constraints. Yet low probability is often confused with narrative possibility, and narrative possibility is what drives reinterpretation. At this stage, it becomes important to examine how historical narratives evolve over time. Early accounts of major historical events often begin as fragmented recollections. Over time, they are written down, compiled, translated, and interpreted through the cultural lens of each generation. This means that what modern audiences receive is not raw history, but layered history. Each layer adds interpretation, emphasis, and structure, and each layer moves further from the original moment of occurrence. This is not unique to any one historical event. It is a general principle of historical transmission, but when applied to highly significant events, such as the crucifixion narrative, these layers take on additional meaning. They are not viewed merely as historical evolution, but as theological development, cultural memory, and symbolic transformation. And with each transformation, interpretive flexibility increases. Another dimension that often enters these discussions is the role of authority in historical preservation. Who recorded the events, who preserved them, and who had the power to define what was worth preserving? In ancient systems, record preservation was not neutral. It was selective. Political stability, institutional priorities, and cultural transitions all influence what survived. This means that absence in historical record does not necessarily indicate absence in historical reality. It indicates absence in preservation. But this distinction is often misunderstood. Absence of evidence is not evidence of alternative evidence. It is simply a boundary condition of historical reconstruction. Yet boundaries are precisely where speculation emerges. Some alternative frameworks attempt to reconstruct events by combining medical analysis, textual comparison, and administrative inference. These approaches often generate compelling narratives, but struggle with verification due to a lack of independent corroboration. Without multiple independent sources, reconstruction remains hypothetical, and hypothesis must remain distinct from conclusion. At this point in the investigation, a broader question emerges that goes beyond the crucifixion narrative itself. Why do human societies repeatedly generate alternative explanations for foundational historical events? Part of the answer may lie in cognitive pattern recognition. The human mind seeks coherence. When confronted with incomplete information, it naturally attempts to fill gaps. This is not a flaw. It is a cognitive feature that supports understanding under uncertainty. However, in historical contexts, this feature can lead to overextension of inference. Patterns are detected where none were intended. Connections are formed between unrelated fragments, and narratives emerge that feel coherent, even when evidentiary support is limited. This does not invalidate curiosity, but it does highlight the difference between interpretation and reconstruction. As the analysis continues, it becomes increasingly clear that the persistence of survival-based theories is less about evidence and more about narrative tension. The crucifixion narrative itself represents a moment of profound historical and symbolic weight. Events of this magnitude naturally attract layered reinterpretation across generations. This is especially true when historical events intersect with religious belief systems, where meaning often carries equal or greater weight than procedural accuracy. In such cases, the boundary between history and interpretation becomes fluid, and fluid boundaries are fertile ground for alternative theories. Yet even within this interpretive space, certain constraints remain constant. Physical laws do not change with interpretation. Physiological limits do not shift based on narrative framing. And historical methodology still requires consistency with available evidence. These constraints do not eliminate speculation, but they do define its limits. At this stage, the investigation reaches a reflective point, not a conclusion, but an assessment of the framework itself. The Roman secret files concept ultimately functions as a metaphorical structure. It represents the unknowns within ancient historical reconstruction rather than literal suppressed documentation. And within that metaphor, the crucifixion narrative becomes a case study in how history is assembled from fragments rather than complete records. The surviving text provides structure. Archaeology provides context. Historical analysis provides interpretation. But none of these sources deliver total reconstruction. And total reconstruction may be impossible by definition, because history is not preserved in full. It is preserved in fragments that survive time, chance, and cultural transition. And so the final reflection of this expanded investigation returns to the central tension that has guided the entire narrative. Not certainty, not denial, but unresolved inquiry. What happened after crucifixion is recorded within tradition, but how those records are interpreted continues to evolve. And as long as interpretation continues, so too does the space for alternative questioning, not because history is unclear, but because history, once fragmented, is always open to reconsideration. And in that reconsideration, the story does not end, it continues.